In a previous video, a link to which you can find in the description below, we looked at the early years of the reign of Henry II, beginning with his succession to the throne in 1154 up until the year of 1157. The first few years of Henry's reign were successful, but the following period, which we discuss in this video, would bring different challenges for Henry. Firstly, trouble arose between Henry and Malcolm IV of Scotland early in 1158, after the King of Scots had given Henry some reason to mistrust him. This led to the English king refusing to knight the young Malcolm. Henry eventually knighted Malcolm 18 months later, after the Scots king had joined him on an expedition to France. Then the Welsh went into open rebellion against Henry, which would not have been any great shock to the English king, as they had been troublesome before, and, after subduing them once again, Henry went one step further to ensure their good behaviour by taking hostages. Satisfied, Henry, that same month of August 1158, then travelled to France to meet King Louis VII. Whilst Henry was in France, a marriage agreement was reached between the English and French crowns for Henry's infant son, who would be known as Henry the Young King. Henry was to marry Louis's daughter, who was, at the time, literally a newborn. Thankfully, they waited until the little girl had reached the grand old age of 2 before the ceremony actually took place. Chancellor Thomas Becket played a key role in negotiations, travelling to Paris, where he was greeted honourably. In September of 1158, Queen Eleanor gave birth to another son for Henry. This boy is named Geoffrey. If things had seemed fairly amicable between Henry and Louis at this stage, after all they were potential rivals, especially given Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, Louis's former wife, then things could have gone seriously wrong in 1159. Henry laid claim to Toulouse, which he proceeded to besiege. However, Louis intervened, acting on behalf of his brother-in-law, who also laid claim to Toulouse. Louis entered the town, but this did not stop Thomas Becket from urging Henry to escalate the situation, which could potentially threaten war. Henry, however, kept a cooler head, and in October of that year he pulled back from Toulouse. However, Henry appears to have borne a grudge against the French king, and he attacked some of Louis's lands near Beauvais in retaliation. The situation threatened to escalate again as Henry began to capture key fortresses. Louis, perhaps considering he had made a mistake interfering in Toulouse, had little option but to sue for peace with Henry. In 1160, hostilities began to simmer down, and the two kings met on numerous occasions, including at a council to discuss a disputed papacy. Henry's son, Henry the Young King, although not the Young King at this stage, then paid homage to Louis for the Duchy of Normandy. Again, although on the surface it looked as though relations had been satisfactorily stabilised, it's clear Henry didn't trust his French counterpart. Across the winter of 1160 to 1161, Henry built new fortifications in his French territories and completed extensive building work on already existing strongholds. In April of 1161, Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald of Bec, died. Henry's choice as his replacement is Chancellor Thomas Becket, who is extremely reluctant to accept, and it would take over a year before he is finally consecrated as Archbishop. This would prove to be one of the most fateful decisions in medieval history. Whilst Henry attempted to persuade Becket, his rocky relationship with Louis continued, and throughout 1161 the two kings continued to bicker, although they would patch things up in October of that year. And finally, in the spring of 1162, Becket finally gives in and agrees to become Archbishop of Canterbury, and he is consecrated in June. At the time of Becket's confirmed election, Henry would have been given an enormous boost. He had filled the most important position in the church in England with a close ally, which, as he hoped, would prove crucial in him rooting out the corruption in the church that had set in during the reign of King Stephen. Henry could not possibly have known what was to follow. In September of 1162, Henry and Louis met with the Pope to try and settle their differences. Relatively content after the meeting, Henry returned to England a few months later, and early in the new year, he met with his new Archbishop of Canterbury, Becket. In March of 1163, Henry oversaw a trial of a nobleman who was accused of spreading false rumours that the king had died, and the matter is resolved around 4 weeks later. Also in March of that year, Henry held a council regarding the vacant bishopric of London. Pope Alexander approved the election of Gilbert, Bishop of Hereford. However, Gilbert is reluctant, and it takes some prompting from Henry to get Gilbert to finally accept. Meanwhile, Becket and the Archbishop of York travelled to the Council of Tours, where they meet Pope Alexander. In the summer of 1163, Henry had homage paid to him by Malcolm of Scotland, but tensions start to grow between the king and Becket in July of that year. A member of Becket's clergy was stood accused by one of Henry's justiciars of murder. The clergyman was, perhaps unsurprisingly, cleared by the church, but the justiciar pressed the issue further, only to be met with hostility from the church. Becket has the man tried for murder, but he is again acquitted, although found guilty of contempt. Henry is unamused by the sham trial and makes it known during a speech that Becket is not in his good books. After a period of plotting his next move against Becket, Henry in October 1163 held a church synod in which he made abundantly clear that he is not happy with the state of the English church and the corruption of its clergymen. Henry then demanded the right to try church clerks accused of committing crimes, only for Becket and his bishops to point blank refuse. To say Henry is growing irritated is to put it mildly. The king then took his son Prince Henry out of Becket's supervision and care, and also seized two of Becket's castles at Ely and Berkhamsted. The following day, Henry departed the synod in a furious mood. A meeting was then held after the disastrous synod to try and patch things up between Becket and Henry, but again tensions rise between the Archbishop and King, and again a compromise fails to materialise.